Who's going to win the 2019 UK general election? Well, welcome back, guys, and I'm sorry I've been away. I just got bored of talking about Brexit, so here I am back talking about Brexit, and more specifically the election for the next few months. I'll be talking more specifically about the parties coming up, but today we're talking about the overall general picture and trying to predict what the outcome, what the result might be, which party might win, what kind of seats each party is going to get. So these are the polls at the moment, and it shows that the Conservatives are well on track to winning the overall vote share. How many seats they win all depends on what their eventual vote share will be, but right now they're on about 35%. Labour Party are way behind, about 25%. The Liberal Democrats on about 20%. The Brexit Party on about 15%, and the Greens way below on 5%. What does this mean? Well, it shows us that, number one, since Boris Johnson came into power, which was about here, he has gained the overall Conservative popularity, and it stayed relatively stable in this 35% area. The Labour Party, on the other hand, has struggled to gain any popularity in the polling. I'll admit, right at the start of this video, these are polls. Polls can be wrong. They are the best estimates we have for predicting the results of the 2019 election. Another thing you might notice, the Labour line directly mirrors the Liberal Democrat line. As the Liberal Democrat line goes up, the Labour line goes down, and vice versa. And likewise, the Brexit Party line mirrors the Conservative Party line. I wonder which party is stealing votes from who. Well, it's not necessarily quite that obvious. In other words, people who vote for the Conservative Party might not necessarily vote for the Brexit Party, and likewise, people that vote for the Labour Party might not necessarily ever vote for the Liberal Democrats. But it does prove that polling at the moment is a reflection on Brexit views. We'll get into that later. But first, I want to try and predict how these lines are going to kind of go over the course of the campaign. As of making this video, we are 40 days away from the election. So I had a look at previous elections and took back 40 days and looked at their polling and where they ended up. So it's a bit blurry because I had to kind of stretch this, but in 2010, you can see that the Conservatives were above to what they are now, about nearer 40%. Labour Party were well above to what they are now, nearer 35%, and the Liberal Democrats were about where they are now. And it was Labour's losses that led to a Liberal Democrat gain, and the Liberal Democrat actually overtook Labour in the polls. And if you remember, the Conservatives had a vote share of 36.1%. They had 306 seats in total, a hung parliament. Labour had 258 seats, 29% of the vote share. The Liberal Democrats did amazingly well, 57 seats with 23% of the vote share, and eventually they went into coalition with the Conservative Party. The SNP had just 6 seats with 1.7% of the vote share, and UKIP back then only had 3.1% of the vote share by 2015. Conservatives were in a largely similar position to what they are now, but Labour were well ahead at 35% of the vote share. And what happened was that as the UKIP vote share went down, which is similar to what it is now, the Conservative vote share went up. We'll be looking at the reasons why in upcoming videos, but you can also see that the Liberal Democrat vote share was way down, meaning the Labour vote share was way up. In other words, there were only so many votes within the country, and therefore, when the vote is split away from the main parties towards those third parties, the main parties lose out. But when votes go away from those third parties towards the main parties, then those main parties gain. And that's exactly what happened in this election. So the Conservatives gained 36.8% of the vote share, 330 seats, and had a slight majority. Labour had 232 seats, 30.4% of the vote share. The Liberal Democrats had just 8 seats, burnt from going into coalition with the Conservatives with just 7.9% of the vote share. The SNP did amazingly well with 56 seats after the Scottish independence referendum and 4.7% of the vote share. And UKIP were proving popular by this point as well, as Euroscepticism was on the rise with 12.6% of the vote share. Interesting. Then we get to 2017. The Conservatives were much, much higher than what they are now, 45%. Labour was only slightly higher than what they are now, at 30%. The Liberal Democrats were a lot lower than what they are now. Still burned from that 2010 election results and their failures and tuition fees that came with the coalition government. And UKIP, being a kind of spent force, were much lower by this point. So that made Theresa May feel that she could win the election. But of course, the campaign went really well for Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party, and that's why we see this huge spike. And he nearly overtook the Conservative Party, but he ended up with more seats, but not enough to form a government. And the result was 317 seats to the Conservatives. She lost seats. Labour, 262 seats, 40% of the vote share. The Liberal Democrats, 12 seats and 7.4% of the vote share. The SNP losing out, 35 seats and 3% of the vote share. And UKIP, 0 seats and 0% of the vote share. So where do polls predict this election will go now? Well, polling shows that Jeremy Corbyn himself is a terribly unpopular leader. The other leaders kind of muddled around the same area. Now, you can see that Boris Johnson is perhaps the most volatile leader in popularity. In other words, he's either really popular or really unpopular. He roller coasters between being the least popular of the other 4 leaders and the most popular of the other 4 leaders. That's why this election is so hard to predict. Jo Swinson is relatively popular, whereas Nicola Sturgeon and Nigel Farage have more of a stable electorate base. In other words, the people that support Boris Johnson, Jo Swinson and Jeremy Corbyn change opinions based on the news. The people that support Nicola Sturgeon and Nigel Farage, on the other hand, have more fixed opinions. And we'll get onto their particular policies and what these people particularly believe in. Boris Johnson, Jeremy Corbyn and Jo Swinson, Boris Johnson and Jeremy Corbyn in particular, are the main parties. So you're more likely to see fluid policies that react to the times. But the fringe parties, the third parties, the parties on the outside of those main parties, they seem to have more fixed policies that are designed to be radical, to cut through politics and to persuade the main parties to adopt their policies, because it's unlikely that Jo Swinson, Nicola Sturgeon and Nigel Farage will become Prime Minister, but what they can do is get this policy, whether it be no deal or a Scottish independence referendum or it be revoking Article 50, is get that punching through the electorate and get it fixed into law. So, for example, Jo Swinson's popularity and the Liberal Democrat popularity in general has persuaded the Labour Party to edge towards the Remain side of the argument, because they know that Labour lose out to the Liberal Democrats. Nigel Farage no deal argument has persuaded the Conservatives to be more gung-ho when it comes to Brexit, because they know that they will lose out to the Brexit Party if they don't deliver Brexit, and more importantly, if they don't deliver the type of Brexit, as in not a soft Brexit, that Leave voters want. And another thing to point out is that Jeremy Corbyn in general has been relatively, I wouldn't say supportive, but not opposing a second Scottish independence referendum. I think he even said that he'd have one within after a year if he was voted into politics. And that's mainly because he wants to try and steal votes in Scotland and gain back his Scottish electorate. But of course, not opposing policies of parties that you're trying to stand against can work against you when those parties seem stronger on those policies. For example, it's an issue of trust, whether the electorate trusts Boris Johnson, for example, to eventually leave the EU without a deal, if that was on his manifesto, as that was originally on his manifesto during the leadership contest. Of course, it's not now that he's got a deal. It's an issue of trust whether the Labour Party would back remaining in the EU. And of course, the Liberal Democrats have a much stronger message on that because they say, no matter what, they're going to revoke Article 50. So I'd say that the third parties and the fourth parties are much more trusted on their policies than the main party leaders. And that's why you're seeing this volatility. Also, what I would like to point out is that most of the polls are showing that we're either going to have a Conservative majority or it's going to be a hung parliament. None of the polls are showing a Labour majority at this point. And I'd stress, at this point, volatility is key in the two main parties. So many people have said that this is a Brexit election, meaning that Brexit is going to be top of people's minds when people put a cross in that box. Polling suggests that if there was a referendum on Britain's membership of the EU, that most people would still vote Remain. Although Leave has grown a bit more recently, Remain has been popular pretty much since the 2016 referendum, definitely since 2017. When asked, do you think the Brexit plan recently announced by Boris Johnson is a good or bad deal for the UK? You can see that the bright green line is people that just don't know or haven't really heard or haven't really looked at the detail. The red line is people that neither think it's a good deal nor a bad deal. The dark green line are people that think it's a good deal. The yellow line are people that think it's a bad deal. So more people think it's a good deal than it is a bad deal, but most people kind of don't really know. The light blue line is a very bad deal, and the dark blue line is a very good deal. So in other words, it's meh. It's somewhere in the middle amongst the pollsters. When asked in a second EU referendum between Remain and No Deal, how would you vote? You can see that when it's between Remain and No Deal, most people would prefer to remain in the EU, over 60%, with 30% choosing to leave without a deal. When asked in a second EU referendum between leaving via Boris Johnson's deal or No Deal, how would you vote? Most people would prefer to leave with Boris Johnson's deal than to leave without a deal. And when asked, how would you most like to leave with no deal, leave with a deal, have a referendum on a deal, or to cancel Brexit and stay in the EU? Well, leaving with no deal is Nigel Farage's policy. Leaving with a deal is Boris Johnson's policy. Having a referendum on a deal is Jeremy Corbyn's policy. And cancelling Brexit is Joe Swinson and the Liberal Democrats' policy. And you see the most popular policy is to leave with a deal, the Conservative policy, proving why the Conservatives are polling so high at the moment. Second most popular policy is to cancel or stay in the EU, in other words, revoke Article 50, Joe Swinson and the Liberal Democrats' policy, showing that Joe Swinson and the Liberal Democrats will never die down in the polls as long as this remains their policy and as long as Brexit remains the top priority for voters. Other issues could play into this election, by the way, and volatility in the main parties is key. But as long as Brexit remains the issue, then the Conservatives are going to stay on top, the Liberal Democrats eating into the Labour Party majority. After that, the Brexit Party and leaving without a deal is popular. And finally, least popular is a referendum on the deal, proving why the Labour Party are doing so badly. But of course, the Labour Party are second, the Liberal Democrats are third. Why is that? Well, this is a general election. People vote for the party that they feel is going to be the Prime Minister. And of course, history shows us that that's either Labour or the Conservatives. But Conservatives look set on course to win this election. If we look at recent polling and apply it to a map of the country, I'm going to take the Conservative vote share down to about 38%. So you see that Stirling has gone to the SNP, Copeland has gone to Labour, Corby has gone to Labour, Scarborough has gone to Labour, and Gordon has gone to the SNP. Let's take the Labour vote share down to about 27%, and you start to see Conservative holds Clyde West, Plaid Cymru gain in Wales, and we can see the SNP starting to gain huge in Livingston. And if I keep going, you'll see the map starting to turn yellow and orange and green and blue as the Labour Party do so poorly. Now let's take the Liberal Democrats to what they are, 15%, and we'll see what happens. So the SNP hold Argyll and Bute, Conservatives hold Brecon and Northshire, and we're back to a Conservative majority of 44. Let's take the Brexit Party, or in this case UKIP, majority down to 10%, see what happens. And we're on course for a Conservative majority of 44 with current polling predictions. That means 347 seats to the Conservatives, 214 to Labour, 24 to the Liberal Democrats, and no seats to the Brexit Party. And this is how the map could possibly look. In other words, mostly Labour London, again, mostly Labour Manchester and the North and inner city areas where they're strong and they're always going to be strong, but Conservative majority overall in the suburbs of the UK. Again, this map is based on the 2017 election, and it could change massively based on the EU referendum results and the way in which the Labour Party has been voting. So it could mean that these northern areas are Brexit Party Conservative areas, the southern areas are Liberal Democrat areas, perhaps some Labour areas in there too, and we actually see more of a colour divide within the country, north, south and Scotland, which will inevitably be either a little bit or a lot yellow. So what polling currently suggests is that the Conservatives will win a majority. The question is, how big? Now, this is based on the election being a Brexit election, the Liberal Democrats eating into Labour seats, and the Brexit Party eating into Conservative seats, the Brexit Party not doing as well as they could do, and the deal being more popular than any other option in regards to Brexit. But I've shown Jeremy Corbyn and Boris Johnson have majorly volatile relationships with the electorate. Anything can change, especially if a different issue comes into the electorate's mindset, and that could massively affect the election. Still wait and see, but so far I'm predicting a Tory majority. But do you agree with me? Join in the debate below and subscribe.